Mr. President, those of us who've had a chance over some time now to work with the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, knows that he is a man of ideas and often thinking well beyond the moment. I had a chance the other day to read a paper that he'd prepared on President Trump's Moon-Mars development project, and I want to borrow heavily from his thinking as I talk about this project today. It's an important time. We just spent significant time remembering, appreciating, looking back at the 50th anniversary of American astronauts landing on the moon and returning safely. 50 years goes quicker than you might think, but really for the first time in that 50 years, we're really at a point where there is a chance that we could cease to be the leading power in space. We decided we were going to become the leading power in space. We became the leading power in space. We have been the leading power in space, but that's not necessarily a given, and you can only last so long living on your past accomplishments. President Trump on the 4th of July made this comment. He said, "I want you to know that we are going back to the moon very soon, and someday soon we'll plant an American flag on Mars." My guess is that that was received with sort of the same amount of skepticism that President Kennedy's challenge was more than 50 years ago. Now, there's no question that the Artemis project that President Trump is talking about is not the Apollo project 50 years later. This is no longer an effort just to get somewhere and get back. We know we can do that. It is an effort to look at where we might go next and why we might benefit from that. You know, in May of 1961, President Kennedy challenged the Congress by saying we should commit ourselves to achieving the goal. He was talking about the goal of getting to the moon. We should commit ourselves to achieving the goal before this decade is out and landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Pretty heavy skepticism. I think 58% of the American people polled that they were opposed to doing that. Why would we send somebody to the moon? Why would we worry about whether we could get them there? And of course, if we got them there, we'd want to get them back. But there was great skepticism. So almost a year later, a little over a year later, at Rice University, President Kennedy tried again to explain that. He said, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. That's one of the famous quotes that if you look back at President Kennedy's challenge to the country, you hear it. We're going not because it's easy, but because they are hard. He went on to say, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one we are willing to accept. And he said we are unwilling to postpone, and we intend to win. There's nothing wrong with an America who wants to win. There's nothing wrong with an America who doesn't want to take second place. There's nothing wrong with an America that wants to set a standard that everybody else could hope to achieve. We've been caught a little flat-footed in the mid-50s when the Russians put a satellite in space, the Sputnik, and Americans would go out and see if they could measure when it was passing over, that you'd put something up there that appeared to perpetually be there, and then there was a cosmonaut in space. But President Kennedy said, we don't want to accept anything more than the opportunity to meet big challenges and show what we can do to test ourselves. So the Vice President of the United States, Vice President Pence, said at the National Space Council in Huntsville, Alabama, on March the 26th of this year, he said 50 years ago, one small step for man became one giant leap for mankind. If you had to be really trying to avoid it to not hear that quote last week as it was being repeated over and over again. But the Vice President said, but now it's time for us to make the next giant leap and return American astronauts to the moon, establish a permanent base there, and develop the technologies to take American astronauts to Mars and beyond. That's the next giant leap, according to the Vice President. You'll note here that the direct connection between the moon development and going to Mars, as the President put it, is there. It's the reason to go back to the moon. It's the reason to do what we can to understand the moon. Our goal is not just getting to the moon. Of course, we've already done that. Our goal is to be there and to do that in a way that works for us. Now, John Marburger, the Vice President George W. Bush's science advisor, said in 2006, the moon is the closest source of material that lies out of Earth's gravity. The closest place we can go and get material that can be used with 3D printing and all sorts of things. Things are possible to construct on the moon that weren't possible to construct anywhere in that same way just a few years ago. The first phase of science on the moon would be a lot like Antarctica. I haven't been to Antarctica. I'd like to go sometime. But you know, we don't have people on Antarctica because Antarctica is an easy place to live. We have people staying all the time on Antarctica to see what we can learn by being on the continent of Antarctica all the time. The next phase of the moon would be like that, where people go to the moon, they stay on the moon, they look at opportunities on the parts of the moon where we believe there's ice. And I know the formula for this. If you've got ice, you've probably got some form of water. And if you got water, lots of things can happen that might not happen otherwise. This is a project that will inspire others to want to be part of it, whether it's Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or Richard Branson or Paul Allen, who has passed on but was intrigued by the moon. They are all people that have great private resources. You know, the founding of America was founded on a public-private model. Jamestown, Pilgrim Plantation, the East India Company, all were private individuals with government sponsorship trying to make something happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. That, I'd suggest, Mr. President, can happen on the moon. In Newt Gingrich's telling of the challenge on the moon, he repeated that great story of what happened at Walman Rink and how it might relate to what can happen on the moon if you're just not bound by the normal things that bind a lot of people. Every person thinking about the Moon-Mars project, according to former Speaker Gingrich, should look at what Donald Trump did at the Walman Rink. The Walman Rink was a very popular site for ice skating in New York City in 1980 when it broke down, and it totally broke down. The city of New York spent 6 years and $13 million trying to fix the ice rink. Fortunately, I guess, for the city of New York and ice skaters that go there, the abandoned ice rink happened to be within sight of President Trump's apartment. And he kept complaining about the ice rink, the failure of the city to do anything about the ice rink. Finally, Mayor Koch just said to Donald Trump, well, why don't you fix it if you think this is so easily done? And he did. He fixed the ice rink in 4 months for $2.25 million. I remember the city had already spent $13 million in failing to fix the ice rink. $2.25 million. The first year after the ice rink was fixed, 225,000 people skated on the ice rink. And one reason that the president was able to do that as a private citizen was he just wasn't bound by the things that bound most people. He wasn't bound by the things that bind the government. The historic project to fix the Walman Rink achieved a goal of a fifth the cost and 1/18 the time that the city had used not to get it done, and ice skaters flourished. Well, the same kinds of things can happen if we look beyond their normal boundaries of what can happen in this project that the president's talked about. In March of this year, again, going back to the vice president, and remember, by the way, on the effort to get to the moon, President Kennedy turned that project over to the Vice President Johnson, and said, you're going to be in charge of NASA, and you're going to be the point person on the moon project. So there's a little history there maybe repeating itself, when in March of this year at Huntsville, Alabama, the vice president outlined the principles that we could use to meet the goals that the president had established for our efforts in space. Now, principle one, Mr. President, was establish a big goal and then stick to it. Remember, why did we go to the moon to start with? Not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Establish a big goal and then stick to it. Failure to achieve our goal to return astronauts to the moon in the next 5 years, according to the vice president, not an option. Principle two, be prepared to reach outside the traditional bureaucracy to new entrepreneurial private companies if it's necessary to get the job done. He went on to say, we're not committed to any one contractor, we're not committed to any one company. If our current contractors can't do what we think they can do, we'll find new ones. If American industry can provide critical commercial services without government development, then we'll buy into that project and share it with them. If commercial rockets are the only way to get American astronauts to the moon in the next 5 years, then commercial rockets will be the way we return to the moon. And principle three said, be willing to change the bureaucracy rather than abandon the goal. If we call on NASA to not just adopt new policies, but to embrace a new mindset, that really begins with setting a bold goal and staying on schedule. A new mindset matters. Failure is not an option. The willingness to postpone our goal, as President Kennedy said almost 60 years ago, not an option. Principle five was be determined to change the bureaucracy in fundamental ways. NASA must transform itself into a leader, more accountable organization. If NASA's not currently capable of landing American astronauts, men and women, on the moon in 5 years, we need to change the organization, not change the mission. And then principle five, which, by the way, Mr. President, I know in your case this is coming from private business, this might be your most important principle. Urgency must replace complacency. The hardest thing to achieve in government is just to drive to a result. And that fifth principle that the vice president set out is exactly that. It's not just competition against our adversaries, it's frankly competition against our worst enemy, complacency. Competition against our own willingness to believe that things aren't going to happen that clearly can happen. This is a great goal. It is a step to the moon and beyond. It is a step outside our solar system to other solar systems. In our lifetime, may not see much of that, but this is not about our lifetime. This is about a step into the future. I applaud the president and the vice president for their leadership here. I look forward to applying those five principles. And by the way, I think almost all of those principles are five principles we could apply to government every day and have a more effective government if we do.